So far in this level, we've talked about how to measure economic growth. We measure it in terms of real GDP per capita. And then we talked about getting rid of inflation, what inflation was and what caused it. Because if we want to measure economic growth, we need to take out the inflation and measure real GDP. So we talked about how to get rid of inflation or pull it out of the calculation to find real GDP, and we can find real GDP per capita to find economic growth. So now that we have all that information, we have our real GDP per capita, let's determine whether the economy is growing or shrinking. So to calculate real GDP per capita, we are looking at the change in real GDP per capita. So when you look at calculating economic growth, we can use new minus old divided by old times 100. That's the general formula for any time you are calculating a change. And in this case, the new and the old are going to be our real GDP per capita. So we're going to find real GDP divided by the size of the population and then compare new and old, so 1 year to the next, and we can figure out if the economy is growing. So let's look here more detail. So in 2014, the real GDP for Canada was $1.7 trillion. Okay? The population was 35.67 million. So to find real GDP per capita, we need to take that $1.74 trillion and divide by the 35,677,466. When we do that, what we get is, well, let's do that quick calculation. Two, 4, 8, 0. 6, 7, 7. When we do that, we get 48,840. Okay, and of course we can double check our number because it should match that number that we had on that previous slide. All right, for 2015, we had $1.756 trillion worth of goods and services, and we had 35,981,735. So if we divide those two, we can then find out our real GDP per capita for 2015. So let's do that calculation. 1,756,675, all those zeros. 35 divided by 35,981,735, and we get 48,821. All right, let's do 2016 as well. So we had 1.795 trillion. Notice this number is not the same as the GDP you had from an earlier level where you had 2.1 trillion for 2017. And that adjustment from a 2.1 down to 1.8 essentially is pulling out the inflation, giving us that real GDP using the methods that we talked about earlier in this level. So to find real GDP per capita, we take our 1.795 and so on, divide that by the 36,443,000. So let's do that calculation. 1,795,129 and all those zeros divided by 36,443,632. And we get 49,258. Just check my numbers quickly here with what they should be. 49,258. Okay, so now that we have our real GDP per capita, we can use the formula new minus old divided by old times 100. So how much economic growth was there between 2014 and 2015? To find out, we do 48,821 minus 48,821. 840, divide by 48,840 times 100, and we'll get the economic growth. So 48,821 minus 48,840 divided by, or 48,840 times by 100. All right, so when we do that, notice that we get a negative number, right? What is that number? Negative 0.04%. So did the economy grow or shrink? Well, the number's negative, so the economy shrank 2014 to 2015. So we can see here the impact that the drop in demand and the drop in oil prices had on our economy. Our economy shrunk, but just a tiny, tiny bit. Okay, negative 0.0389, so on. So about 0.04% was that it declined. Well, what about from 15 to 16? So we take new, which is the 2016 number, 49,258, subtract the 2015 number, which is 48,821, and divide by old, which is 48,821, and multiply that times 100. All right, we do that calculation. So 49258 minus 48,821 divided by the old number, which is 48,821, multiply times 100. And in this case, what we get is 0.895. So economic growth is just under 1%, about 0.9%. So between 2015 and 2016, the economy is growing, but very slowly. We can compare this to previous years. So what you see down here is the economic growth over the last number of years. 2013-14, we're at 1.5% growth. 2010-2011, over 2% growth. You can see back 2007, 2008, 2009, that recession. You can see in the peak of the recession, we had negative 4% growth. Okay. Now, you're pointing out here that we had 2 years of negative growth. Well, remember, we define a recession as 2 quarters or half a year of declining real GDP. We definitely had that, but we weren't at a depression, which is 2 years of declining real GDP, because there were months within there where the economy saw some growth. So there, that technical definition means that we didn't see a depression during that time. So you calculate real GDP, take out the inflation, divide it by the population, that gives you real GDP per capita, and then you can compare 2 years with new minus old divided by old times 100. And then you can get economic growth. And we can then see, theoretically we could see, let's get our graph to show back up again, what's been happening to economic growth in Canada over time. So let's see if we can't get that graph to show up. So long term, we've been seeing growth. Real GDP has been increasing, but we do have that instability in the market and those business cycles, and so we do have periods of decline, like we saw in 2007, 2008, like we saw in 2015. And so hopefully momentarily we can show some of that on a graph. See if we can't get that back. All right, so pardon a moment while I scroll to the other end. All right, so here's the graph we're trying to get to. So this you can see, you see this little blip downturn here in 2015. That's that very tiny negative economic growth that we just calculated. Here's that negative economic growth in 2008, 2009. And we can go back and we can see recessions in the 90s as well as the 80s. Now, when we're looking at economic growth, we can use what is called the rule of 70 to help determine how long before our economy will double in size. You can use the same rule of 70 to figure out how long it will take an investment to double in size. So anything that has a growth rate, whether it's an inflation rate or whether it's economic growth, then or a rate of return, you can use the rule of 70 to figure out how long it will take something to double. So for example, if you have $1,000 and you put it into a savings account that earns 5% per year, then you can take 70 divided by 5, and it's just a quick calculation to estimate how long it will take before your $1,000 doubles. And so 70 divided by 5 is 14, so it'll take 14 years for your $1,000 to become $2,000. We can do the same type of calculation with our economic growth. So if we go back, we found that in 2015 to 2016, the economy was growing at 0.9%. So we could figure out how long it would take for our economy to double in size by taking 70 divided by that 0.9. So you get rid of the percent and you just take the number. So we had 0.9%, so it's 70 divided by 0.9. If you do 70 divided by 0.9, what do you get? Well, you get 77.77. So essentially it would take 78 years for the Canadian economy to double if it's growing at a rate of just under 1% a year. Well, what if the economy is growing what was the previous year? If it was growing at a rate of negative 0.04%, how long would it take to double? Well, if it's shrinking, it would never double in size, right? So in order to get our economy to grow and to get a bigger economy, we need more of a growth rate. It needs to be positive, and typically we're looking for a growth rate that's more than that 1%. In an economy like Canada, the goal is really about 3%. It's really hard for a well-developed country to grow at more than 5%.